Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. I am the librarian Katrina. How are you doing today? If you are new here, welcome. This is where I am reading through my enormous library of books. Then I give you a quick synopsis and I tell you what I think about them. So if you like books, just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos. Let me know what you think in the comments. So we spent the last 2 months diving into the super depressing world of authoritarianism. First, in August, we had Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Then last month, we worked our way through William L. Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. All of that is some pretty depressing reading. So for October, I wanted to give my brain a break from the awful things that people do to each other and spend some time with the supernatural, because Halloween. Anyways, this week's book of the week is Talking to the Dead, Kate and Maggie Fox and the Rise of Spiritualism by Barbara Weisberg. This has been an intriguing one. In March of 1848, Mary Redfield is walking down the road to her house when she's stopped by the children of the new neighbors and told that there have been strange knocking sounds in their house. And basically that's how it started. There was no explanation for the knocking sounds. Nobody knew what was causing them, how this was going on. Basically, the mid-19th century was ripe for a new religious movement to take hold, and that's so quasi-religious. I don't think they don't necessarily go into God too much, but it's a quasi-religious movement, and it's called Spiritualism. Witchcraft was more or less considered a superstition of the past, science was on the rise, and religious organizations were moving more towards a loving God versus the vengeful God of the Old Testament. So when Kate and Maggie Fox began communicating with the source of the strange knocking sounds, this created a sensation in the 19th century. And at first they were only giving demonstrations in their home. They said they were communicating with a peddler who had been murdered by the previous tenant of their rented home. Now this caused a bit of a scandal because people in the area knew the tenant of the former tenant of the home and were like, there's absolutely no way that John Bell would have done this. There's no way. But the knocking sounds continued and they were able to get the ghost to spell out his name. You might be wondering how it happens if all they're hearing all these rapping sounds. Basically, the girls would call out the alphabet, and when the correct letter was reached, the ghost would tap. So it'd be A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And so they would go through the entire alphabet like that, picking out letters. I mean, that must have been freaking tedious. And I kind of wonder if this is how, like, spirit boards were invented, Ouija boards. I'm probably, it should be Ouija if you're going with the correct German pronunciation. But anyways, I kind of wonder if that's how it was created. I know that this is where spirit writing started because it is directly mentioned in the book multiple times that mediums started to basically enter a trance-like state and that the spirits would use their hands to write. Now, eventually, the girls' older sister Leah Fox was her maiden name. She married a gentleman named Fish. She ultimately married 3 times. But she was also determined to be a medium, and she also began hosting a series of very public demonstrations, during which both girls, Kate and Maggie and Leah, were examined by skeptics, basically. None of the skeptics were able to determine how the girls were doing it. It was suggested they were stamping their feet, but the examiners would hold their feet down and the tapping would continue. It was suggested that maybe the girls were ventriloquists, which was definitely known at that time, and it's kind of what I was leaning towards, but a doctor would listen to their breathing through a stethoscope and reported nothing like ventriloquism when the raps would continue. So there was a lot of ooh, this must be real going on because we can't figure out how they're doing it. It was suggested that maybe the girls were popping their bones, and that becomes important later, but ultimately they were seen as the real deal. Now, participants, in addition to the loud raps, participants in these demonstrations would report furniture moving, but no wires were ever found to assist in the movement. Combs would fly from one lady's hair to another, also without assistance, and always with this continuous rapping sound. Friends and relatives who expressed disbelief or the wish for the spirits to leave would find themselves attacked by ghostly hands. Now, all of this sounds frightening, and if it were a well-lit room, sure, but usually, of course, the lights would be very dim or off. So, and they didn't have electricity in the 1840s when all of this started, so they would, lower the gas lights or blow out all the candles, and everything was very dark. And so it adds this air of mystery to the proceedings because you can't see what's going on. So, of course, it could absolutely be somebody walking around smacking people in the back of the head, right? Not at all an impossibility. In fact, that's quite likely. But at the time, this was spooky and fun. It was spooky in a safe sense, very much like riding a roller coaster is today. And so it was quite sensational. All of this is reported in the accounts in the 19th century, and the girls were by no means just accepted as being the real deal. There was a lot of skepticism. Any such claims in the 21st century would most likely be immediately dismissed as absolute quackery, right? It would be like pics or it didn't happen. But in the 19th century, this was direct communication from the spirits. And we were able to get insight into how heaven and the afterlife worked. And the spirits all evolved, basically, and got over their arguments with each other and with humanity and began moving forward. And that's comforting. It's magical, and it's very comforting at a time when child mortality was still very high. You know, you're still having, approximately 1 in 5 children is dying of some childhood disease. Illness, pandemics can sweep through and wipe out entire communities. You got cholera, you've got diphtheria, you've got tuberculosis. All of these things would cause pandemics and wipe people out. And so this ability to communicate with the dead was remarkable. Now, in 1849, science was progressing fast, really fast. We had gone through long periods of time with no science, where the church was everything, but now basically everything is considered a science until it's not. So accepted science of the day was phrenologists, where basically they would feel the bumps in your head and tell you about your personality and what your tendencies were. Hypnotists, they were called mesmerists back then. And if you were mesmerized, you were said to be magnetized, and sometimes the girls would talk to the spirits under this magnetism. And all of this was phenomenal. Inspirational speakers, social and political reformers, healers, doctors, everything is considered scientific until proven it wasn't. And so spiritualism was no different, right? They did these demonstrations. They were unable to be proven wrong, and so it must be the real deal. Hallelujah, we're talking to the dead. Now we have Leah Fox was the oldest. She was, I believe, 27 or 28 when all of this happened, whereas Maggie was 14 and Kate was 11, So Maggie was the older of the two girls, and Kate was considered kind of this great beauty, although both sisters were quite beautiful. Interestingly enough, once these girls came out and started giving their demonstration, a whole lot of psychics started developing. There was a whole lot of them suddenly popping up. A lot of their friends turned out to be psychic too, right? So that's a little suspicious. if everybody you know is suddenly doing the same thing, something's not right. It seems like part of what may have contributed to all of this is that their own father actually was an absentee father. I mean, they were all full-blooded brother or sisters. There was no half relations in here. John David Fox was Leah's father. He was the girl's father, but he was absent for two very different reasons. So when he was absent when Leah was growing up, because he was an alcoholic and a gambler. And so he would vanish for long periods of time into the bottle and gambling. This was such a problem that the girl's mother, Margaret Fox, her father was like, well, you can only have your inheritance when I die through the executor of the estate. I'm not going to release it directly to you, because at this time, any funds released to her would have had to be released to her husband, because that was the law at the time. You know, it sounds very medieval compared to today, but that was quite normal back then for the husband to take control. And and Margaret Fox's father knew that John David was this alcoholic waste of space, and he didn't want to give him control of the finances. So John David Fox is gone. Margaret Fox is receiving stipends from her father's will. That's how Leah grew up. Leah married her first husband, Mr. Fish, very early. I think she was like 14. Again, not unusual in the 19th century. I know that's going to cause some people to freak out, but that was pretty common. It turns out that was too young for him, though, because ultimately he left her because she was so young. Isn't that ironic? And so Leah is making her way as a music teacher when all this started, which is a very genteel way for a lady to make her own way in the world. It was an accepted method of earning your own living. Being a medium and talking to the dead was not an accepted method of earning a living. Now, John David Fox eventually saw the error of his ways. He got clean and sober, he stopped gambling, he found his way to Christ via the Methodist faith, which is a good thing. Fox reconciled with his wife Margaret, and they had two late-in-life daughters, Margaretta, who was Maggie, and Catherine became Kate. And then they started having the wrappings. And the family realized the girls, Kate especially, was capable of communicating with these wrappings. So while John David Fox never officially decried this as evil, he didn't really seem to approve with spirit communication either. And so he was again absent from the home while the girls were doing this, growing up during this period of time. And this is kind of where Barbara Weisberg's scholarship truly begins to shine because all of this is laid out against the backdrop of the 19th century. She's not only describing the girls' lives and their unusual livelihood and why it was considered so unusual in the 19th century, but she does this excellent job laying out the scene of what life was like in the 19th century upstate New York. Here, the abolitionists had solid footing, and so too did the equal rights movement, which were geared toward getting women the vote. It was unusual for women to earn their own way, but it wasn't unheard of. Because this did seem to be a fairly unique feminine phenomenon, men believed it, don't get me wrong, and there were men who came out and eventually became spiritualists themselves. The way they presented themselves was very different on stage. Men would treat it more like a treatise, very much like a scientific movement that needed to be discussed and explained on stage, whereas women would enter this more ethereal, trance-like state to talk to the spirits. And those two approaches created spiritualism as we know it. Prior to becoming a medium, Leah Fish was a music teacher. I mentioned that already, which was, of course, genteelly an approved method of earning your living. She was raising her daughter Lizzie at the time, very much like that. And then, kind of depending on who she would speak with, she had either been abandoned by her husband or he had died. Somewhere in there, one of those things he definitely was not there, so he definitely abandoned her. Whether or not he ever died or they ever officially divorced, I don't know, but she ultimately married another husband. I don't remember his name. I remember the final husband's name, but anyways. Speaking of spirits is not an approved way of earning one living. And much like women today are the very first to shred and attack each other for doing something that they don't get, they don't understand, or they think is slutty, the women in the 19th century tended to be the girls' harshest critics. And the reason for their harshness is because their employment, talking to the spirits, required them to be in darkened room. Yes, there was mixed company, but men were present. And that earned the scornful talk of the polite ladies in society, because what kind of a respectable young lady would sit in a darkened room with a man, chaperone present or not? That was something you did not do in 19th century America. Or England, but America, we were particularly prudish. Gotta love those Puritan roots. Because obviously the girls at 11 and 14 were little Lolitas. Before that was a thing, obviously, because that book, I think, wasn't written until the 20th century. But they were only interested in stealing all the husbands. Why else would they sit in a darkened room and allow men to hold their hands in a circle while they're talking to the dead? Yeah, the dead were present, so were other women, but still, they were holding hands with men who they were not married to or related to, so they must be stealing men. Leah jumped into the family business with both feet, took on the role of business manager. Kate and Maggie at various times experimented with more normal life. Kate, for a while, was the foster daughter of a former congressman and publisher of the New York newspaper. Was it the Times? It was a New York newspaper, but Horace Greeley was his name, so you could Google Horace Greeley and it would pull up his life history. He was a former congressman. Greeley and his wife had become enchanted with Kate when she was able to communicate with their deceased son during this time. Greeley offered basically to foster her and to educate her in some of the finest schools in New York, and enrolling her under an assumed name to combat the infamy of her own. Kate basically hated it in the Greeley household, but her mother recognized the opportunity, and so she stayed there for about a year before rejoining her mother and sisters. For Maggie, her likely way out came in the form of another famous 19th century name, and these kind of became a celebrity couple for the tabloids in the day. Elisha Kent Kane. Now, Kane was from a very well-to-do family, but he was a famous Arctic explorer and a ladies' man. He definitely had at least one child out of wedlock, and he liked to play the field up until he met Maggie, and then apparently he became quite smitten of her, and while the two of them more or less followed proprieties, he wouldn't give gifts to Maggie, he would give them to her mother, and then she could give them to Maggie because that, there's no direct communication, and they saw each other as chaperones, but she was not an approved wife to perspective for this very well-to-do young man whose family was quite wealthy and thought that a lower to middle class working girl who talks to the dead was not exactly their ideal daughter-in-law. So what Kane said is, if you will stay with my friends who I approve of and my family approves of, and go to the schools that finishing schools that I pay for, I'll put you through these schools while I'm doing this Arctic exploration, and we can marry when I come back, but you have to give up talking to the dead. And Maggie said okay. So she did. I mean, but it wasn't consistent. She did stay with his friends, but she would take off for long periods of time to visit with her family. Near as we can tell, she didn't do any readings through there, so she did keep her word as far as not talking to the dead. So that was good. But she kind of bounced around, and when he returned, he tried to break off the engagement, probably at the insistence of his family. But basically, he told Maggie in person, and she agreed. She, gave him back, the ring and signed off on the paper agreeing that they had never been engaged. But then, apparently, he changed his mind and couldn't give her up, so he came back and started courting her again. The last time they saw each other, he had just finished writing his book. He was planning to go to England, where he was going to promote it and talk with John Franklin's widow. John Franklin was the previous Arctic explorer that he had gone off to try to find and rescue if he could. Never found him. Most likely John Franklin died out there on the ice. Well, it's one of those mysteries we're never going to know because, it was 100 years ago. 160, 70 years ago, something like that. But when he hit England, he got sick. Quite sick. It's never specifically identified what, but the doctors believe that the heat and climate in Cuba would probably help him, so he boarded another boat and returned to Cuba, and that's where he died. Now, they never officially married, but according to the Fox family lore, prior to his boarding the boat to England, he and Maggie had stood together in front of Maggie's family and held hands and announced they were married. Now, in the 19th century, you did not have to have a marriage license. That was a direct result of Southern racism in the South after the Civil War, because they wanted to keep, white people from marrying black people. So we didn't have wedding licenses prior to that point in time. So there was no license requirement. There was no requirement to be married in a church. Essentially, just holding hands and saying, yes, we see each other as husband and wife, that was enough to make a marriage. It wasn't common, but it was allowed. And so the problem with this being, the only witnesses was the Fox family. And so, not surprisingly, the Kane family was like, we don't believe you. We are pretty sure you're lying because you're hucksters and frauds. They did not believe in spiritualism. And so we're not going to cut you in on this inheritance. Now, I don't know if Kane actually left her any money. She would reach out to his brother Robert first for just, did he leave any kind of a kind word for me? Is there anything in his will just acknowledging my presence? Ultimately, she did end up asking for money from the Kane family, and they were like, well, we won't give you any money unless you give us back the love letters, because those love letters were proof that they'd had a relationship. And she wouldn't do it. They ultimately came up with a compromise that the families, to ensure that she didn't publish, because that was what the Kane family didn't want, to ensure that she did not publish these love letters, she would have to leave them with a trusted friend, and it was a friend of hers, but the family had to approve of the friend. So they found this intermediary that everybody approved of and agreed with. She gave the letters to him for safekeeping, and he kept the letters as long as she was receiving a stipend from the family. And everybody was happy until the Kane stopped paying the stipend, at which point she got the letters back and immediately published them. Because, yes, why wouldn't you? And that was the sad story of Maggie Fox Kane. She did take his last name and use that till she died, and she never married publicly, I guess. Now, Maggie's world has been shattered, right? This is the death of her common-law husband. She was very much in love with him. Leia's fortunes took a turn for the better, considerably better. She, like I said, married twice. She was definitely a solid widower at this point, and found herself proposed to for the third time, lucky bachelor number 3 being one Daniel Underhill. Now, the Underhills were a quite wealthy Quaker family, but they were believers in spiritualism. He was a very successful businessman. He owned his own insurance company, and they were married on November 3rd, 1858. And this was to be her last marriage, and it lasted until she died. So it was a happy marriage. It worked for them both. She semi-retired. She retired from public performances. She continued to do seances in her own home and for free for friends of hers and her husband's, leaving basically Maggie and Kate to carry on the Fox family business of talking to the dead. Now, Maggie is still retired. She's sworn off the profession because, she promised Kane she would stop, and so she stopped. And that lasted all the way up until the family stopped sending the stipends, and then she needed the money. And so in addition to publishing the love letters that Kane had written to her, she began practicing spiritualism again. At this time, she also began to descend into alcoholism. The girls had already grown up with a bit of a taste for the bottle, and that may have been inherited from their father, who was definitely an alcoholic. But basically, they were feted with champagne at all of these readings they did. So starting from 11 and 14, they were being given alcohol as congratulations, well done. And you got to wonder if this, I mean, alcohol is a mind-altering substance, so did that play a role in their ability to talk to the dead? I don't know, right? So Maggie kind of bounces around from friend to friend, living off the stipend until she starts practicing again. Kate, for her part, travels to England, eventually all the way to Russia, acting as intermediary for the spirits with the newly crowned Tsar Alexander III. And she advised him to not be a tyrant and open his policies towards his political prisoners, which I don't know how that worked out for him, but that policy did not work out so well for Nicholas II. You may recall from the Gulag Archipelago. Now, following her successful tour of Russia, Kate returned to England, where she fell in love and married Henry Dietrich Jenkin. They had 2 children together, Ferdinand, a.k.a. Ferdy, and Henry. After 10 years of marriage, Jenkin died of a stroke, leaving Kate a widow at 44. And like her sister Maggie, she also fell into alcoholism. Apparently, the misfortune of her younger sisters and their acceptance of the bottle as a means of literally drowning their sorrows drew the disapproval rather than the sympathy of Leah. So, while living in New York, an anonymous tip was made to essentially the 19th century version of Child Protective Services, claiming that Kate's 2 sons were being neglected. When the investigators showed up, the boys looked perfectly healthy. Unfortunately for Kate, the day they showed up, she was deep in the bottle, and she was undeniably drunk. And so while the boys looked cared for, well cared for, they were dressed, they were clean, they were polite, they were able to speak in an educated manner, because she was drunk, and that was an absolute no in the 19th century for a woman to be drunk. They took her sons, and I think she may have gone to an asylum of some sort briefly. Now, Kate and Maggie both suspected that Leah had made this anonymous call, okay? They believed that she wanted Kate to hand over her sons to be raised by Leah, because Leah kind of saw herself as mother to all. She saw that herself as the mother to the girls because their own mother was a bit of a pushover. She had nieces and nephews from other brothers and sisters who she said, oh, while you're in our house, call me Ma, call me Ma. And so she saw herself as this sort of surrogate mother to everybody, and she wanted those boys. Now, Maggie decided that she was going to send a telegram claiming to be the boys' uncle from Australia, Uncle Edward, and it worked. Right, that's one of the nice things that would never work today, right? Because the email, the phones, they'd be like, well, you have to show up in person to claim custody of these boys. She sent a telegram saying, I am on my way, please release them, I will be there as soon as I can, and the release was approved. Kate picked them up. Kate and the boys boarded a boat to England, and Kate, Maggie, and the kids lived in England for a time. Now, in 1888, so it's been... all of this happens over the span of 30 years, right? Maggie decides to do a reversal, and she announces to the world publicly on stage where they did on the same stage where they did their first public appearance. So it was like a Corinthian Coliseum or something like that in New York. She went up on stage with one of the skeptics, doctors, and said, it's a fraud. Here's how it happened. When we were very young girls, and she lowered her and Kate's age by a couple of years, so they seemed even younger and more innocent when it started. So instead of being 14 and 11, she said they were like 10 and 6, something like that. So they lowered their ages even more. But they said it was all Leah's fault. They just chucked her ass under a bus. It's Leah's fault. Leah did this. Leah told us how to do it. She taught us. She guided us through it all. This is all Leah's fault. Here's how we did it. We're manipulating the joints in our feet and toes and knees and ankles to create these loud pops. Now, I can't do it. I mean, I could maybe get a toe to pop occasionally, but apparently they could do it at will. And she stood on a table in front of this auditorium and demonstrated how she would crack her toe, and because of the acoustics in the auditorium, that crack could be heard all the way in the back. So it appeared very loud. Yeah, I can't do it. I can't do it. Maybe if I could, the stupid sciatic pain would go away, but I can't make anything pop. But it was very convincing, obviously. The skeptics felt vindicated in their skepticism. The spiritualists thought that she had sold out the movement. Some of the kinder ones said that she was being led astray by bad spirits. So it's amazing how they went from being totally benevolent and awesome and forgiving to having bad spirits lead her astray. Kate sat in the front row throughout all of this, kind of lending her silent support, and Leah never commented. She just, as far as I know, I don't think the sisters ever spoke again after that time, though. And why would Leah care? She's living the good life with her rich husband and their rich house on the hill, and, giving her own free demonstrations. Her friends all still believe her and feel very sorry for her. Their sisters are drunk frauds. So that's kind of sad. Leah, gave presentations up until her death on November 1st, 1890. She was 77. Kate and Maggie died shortly after that, each of them as a result of lifetime of alcoholism. Kate died on July 2nd, 1892 at 55. Maggie died on March 8th, 1893 at 59. They were both poverty-stricken and alcoholics when they died. One interesting thing that did happen, about a decade after the last of the Fox sisters had died, the Hydesville house where they had all been living when everything started, the one that they claimed had been a peddler buried in the basement. And yes, they dug up the basement at the time and nothing was ever found. They kept hitting groundwater. But then in 1904, some school children were playing around the spook house, and wandered down into the basement, because all the way up until the 21st century, when, kids were no longer allowed to play and be kids, you went to abandoned buildings because that was freaking fun, right? You go there and you'd see if you could find a dead person or a ghost or whatever, because it's spooky to be in an abandoned building, an abandoned warehouse, and a abandoned mine. We used to go up to the American Flats here all the time because it was amazing. It's all these broken down abandoned buildings. You're no longer allowed up there because my generation screwed that up for this generation. Sorry, kids. School children go to the house, they go down into the basement. The house, having been unoccupied for many years, was not in good repair. A crumbling wall gave way and revealed a skeleton, which was approximately 50 years old. So that's interesting and lends a little bit of credence to the girls. You gotta wonder, right? I mean, this is 50-year-old skeleton, approximately, so it could have been a little older. It could have been there in 1848. And maybe they were talking to a dead peddler when they were listening to those raps. I tend to agree with the author's assessment. I mean, obviously we don't know if that skeleton is proof that they were actually talking to the spirits. That's kind of left up to everybody to decide. If you're a believer, you're going to believe. If you're not, you're not. I do tend to agree with the author. She says sometimes the communication was real, and sometimes it was a fraud, kind of keep the career path moving forward. But for women who did not marry at all, or did not marry until well past the age that women usually marry. Usually women were marrying around 16, 17, 18 years old. All right, Maggie, such as it was, her marriage to Cain happened when she was about 20, but she never remarried. She was certainly young enough to have done so. And Kate didn't marry until she was 34. Leah married 3 times. Their career options were limited. There could be a teacher or a governess, and those were their options in the 19th century. Or they could do what thousands of other entrepreneurial Americans had done, albeit male entrepreneurs, and they could forge their own career path. And Leah managed it successfully. The younger sisters, not so much. I quite like this book. It does not answer the question as to whether or not the girls were legit, but there's no real way to do that, right? They've been dead and buried 170, or 93, 120 years? 30 years. God. Oh my God, 93 was 30 years ago. If you're a believer, you believe that they were truly communicating with the dead. If you are not, then no amount of proof is ever going to convince you otherwise. Barbara Weisberg does spend a fair amount of time explaining the backdrop of various political movements and how those movements intertwined and fueled spiritualism. And at the end of the book, she goes through explaining how various frauds occurred and were exposed. But, I mean, outside of Maggie's confession and a much earlier private confession allegedly made by Kate, there's really no proof of fraud on the girl's part. And about a year after Maggie confessed, she recanted and said, no, it is all real. And I mean, who knows, right? I mean, I suppose it's possible to crack your toes loud enough to be heard across the room. I mean, especially if you're in a darkened theater. Everybody is hushed because they're expecting to hear something, so everybody's being quiet so they can hear what they're expecting to hear. I think, who knows? I mean, I can't say I've ever heard ghostly rappings, but I certainly seen things that make me wonder what the hell I just saw. Was that real? So who's to say? I mean, My own personal belief tends towards a scientific explanation. I think the multiverse is real. If you've ever delved into that particular thought, I think the multiverse is real, and that what we perceive as ghosts here are where a different timeline in the multiverse branched off and is kind of kissing up against our own dimension. And I'm sure that there's a scientist out there who will eventually watch this and go, that is not how that works! But I'd rather believe that than believe that the dead are tied eternally to this plane, because that's a sad place to be if you're dead. To be tied here watching the living move on without you, that's sad. I don't want to think that. I'd rather think they were someplace happy. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I am keeping this month's spooky theme, so next week is going to be The World of Lore, Monstrous Creatures by Maggie. I will see you then. Bye.